excited, everyone, for this episode of the Miseducation of the American, where we are going to spend time talking about anti-Asian sentiment. As we know, this is a current topic, and so I'm really excited to have my two guests with me today, Karalee and Angela, and I'm going to let you all tell our audience about yourself. So whoever wants to go first, what's your story? Tell us all about you and why you are the perfect person to talk about this topic.
Thanks, Keisha, for that wonderful introduction. I'm Karalee Wong Nakatsuka, and I'm a U.S. history teacher for over 30 years. Started when I was 0, and I grew up in Los Angeles, and I'm a third generation Chinese American. My grandparents immigrated from China, and Angela and I thought it would be good to preface our statements by saying that we're sharing our own personal stories and experiences because AAPI is a very broad category. It is not a monolithic groups. There's dozens of ethnic groups that come to America at different times. Some we know the history better, some less. Systemic structures affect all of us. So when we tell these stories, this racial category of Asians was actually created as a category of exclusion, and it racialized Asians as foreign, not assimilable, not included in America. And we're going to see that theme come continually as we speak today. Angela, what about you?
Hey, so I grew up in the Boston area, and I am Taiwanese and Chinese. And I actually came to Boston because my uncle had immigrated to the United States in the 1930s, and then my aunt had immigrated in the 1940s after World War II, and they met here. So there were a tiny percentage, and as we go through the history, you'll find out why. But that's the reason why we're in Boston, because that's where they settled, and then they sponsored my father to come in the 1970s. So I am a history teacher of 20 plus years. I focus mostly on world history, striving to bring global perspectives into my classroom and to other educators, just, having them hear various stories from around the world. I think that's a way to sort of build understanding and empathy of people who are from sort of global perspectives.
Well, I'm so glad to be in the company of my history people. So thank you. That's great company to be in. And I'm so glad that you all also talked about the fact that the Asian culture isn't a monolith. So we know that there are over 46 countries represented on the Asian continent. So we couldn't have a conversation that put everyone in a nice little box and put them in a bow. And so I think that's such an important comment to make and distinction to make for everyone. So thank you all.
Thank you for having us here.
Thank you for inviting us.
I'm in a good company, and I'm super excited to have you all, and I'm excited because I know history teachers are going to educate me. So this is a selfish endeavor, actually. So let me start by asking you, many would probably presume that anti-Asian hate is a recent phenomenon, and people have a tendency to take an ahistoric view or understanding of the present violence and xenophobia that faces the API community. AAPI, goodness gracious, sorry, AAPI community. What are some historical entry points to ground our current understanding of anti-Asian racism in the United States?
So before we go into the history, Angela and I were talking, and there's 3 tropes that are really helpful in understanding, because even though the AAPI experience is not monolithic, the group is not the same, and we have very diverse experiences, there's 3 tropes that affect all of us surprised about. So although I was born in America, I perfectly see myself as American. I have some Asians who think I'm not Asian enough. Americans think I'm a foreigner. So there's this perpetual foreigner attitude that it's very common. You ask an Asian friend, has anyone asked you, where are you from? Where are you really from? And that's a common thing that happens all the time. It happened to me in Boston at Hard Rock Cafe. So that's something that we always deal with. And sometimes we might not realize, oh, it doesn't happen to other people. Another thing that we have to deal with is the model minority myth. There's an implication that we don't belong and as a foreigner, and also that we don't deserve success, that we're taking more than our fair share. So even though it seems like it's a trope that's like praising and building up people of color, I didn't know that I was a people of color till my son was invited to go to a multicultural student, visit to Cal Berkeley to see if he wanted to go there or not. Before then, I didn't know that I was a person of color. So all this together has affected and informed the life that we lived in. I've throughout my life, I've lacked confidence in certain spaces, especially history spaces. With my family, with my fellow Asians, I could be confident. But in history spaces, I was insecure. I was insecure in college. I remember one time, and I can't remember the exact thing that happened, but there was a classmate and he was saying something negative about Asians. It might have been about taking up too much space in colleges or whatever, but I don't remember exactly, but I remember the feeling. And I also remember the gratitude that I felt by my ally who I didn't even know. I don't even know who she is to this day, but a Black classmate. I was the only Asian in class. So hello, who's being talked about? A Black classmate who didn't even know me. She spoke up and she defended me and Asians. And I'm really grateful for that. And Angela and I want to emphasize that allyship is a powerful thing. Allyship with other AAPI people, but also with non-AAPI people, with other people of color, with white friends, everyone. We can all be allies because I really believe that we are better together. And as I've gotten more representation, I've understood myself more. I've understood the model minority myth. I've gotten bolder and I've reached out to people. And Keisha and I are friends. Angela is friends. I reached out to Angela, and that's how we don't know how tall we are. We've never seen each other below the neck. So we've only met online, but we're really good friends. And that's part of the boldness that we build each other up. But as me being more bold, I was able to reach out and make a connection with Angela.
Yeah, and it's just before launching into the history, there, some of my stories really answer that. It's not, and to me, it's not ahistorical. And throughout my life, there are moments where there has been overt racism that has happened, and a lot of times it's been internalized. And so one example is I was just playing in a driveway. I was sharing this with Karalee yesterday. I was like, oh my gosh, I don't think I've ever shared this with her, but I was playing in a driveway with my other friend who also happened to be Asian, and sometimes kids in the neighborhood would just yell racial slurs at us, and there was one time where it got where they started throwing bricks at us, and I think I was only about 10, 1980s. I was only about to move away, but my friend was not, and she was hit in the stomach with a full-size brick thrown at her while they're calling out racial slurs. So that was one example of overt racism that I experienced, and it was almost daily in the neighborhood that I lived in, mostly white neighborhood. Out, you probably know Somerville in Massachusetts, yes, and very few other Asians in that neighborhood. But then another incident that happened when I was in high school. I was the president of the Asian club of the school, and we always run an evening event once a year. And there was one year where I had put up a bunch of posters. I was walking down that wing. That wing doesn't have a lot of kids, like it's just a passing wing in the school. And as I walked through, I noticed that a bunch of the posters had been defaced. And with racial slurs like scribbled all over them. So I collected all of them. And, I was a 17-year-old student. I went to the principal and the assistant principal, and they said, well, we don't know who did it, so there's nothing we can do about it. Wow. So I think I carried that with me as like all the way through, that feeling of invisibility. Even if I speak up, even if I do, like no one's going to really do anything, right? So, and then I had shared one more story really quickly, is when my kids were young and we were walking through the Boston Children's Museum. and I had one on my hip and one on my hand. And as I was walking through down a ramp, it was like a little more quiet area. I think I was trying to like get them down to the second level or third level quicker. And a man walked by, and I was speaking to my younger one in Chinese because I wanted her to be bilingual. He turned around and he said, "Why don't you go back to your country?" You know, and my daughters are 17 and 13 now. Of course, I rushed away because I'm not going to take on a over 6 foot tall man um, on the spot with my two younger children. I was alone, you know. So these incidences, as I'm seeing them in the news, are really triggering in a lot of ways, because I'm like, they weren't isolated, and now they're finally getting some kind of coverage, you know, in the media. But that, I think that leads into a little bit of a sort of understanding that these things have been happening for a long time. They're not
Can I ask
historical.
a couple of questions to you all?
Yeah, sure.
Karalee, you talked about not even knowing that you belong to the people of color group. Like, why do you think that was? Was that just in terms of like where you lived, you just didn't have that awareness?
A big thing is like, I've been around a long time. I say I'm the old teacher, but I didn't have ethnic studies, and I didn't have like, like imposter syndrome. I didn't know I had imposter syndrome, doubting my abilities, lacking confidence. I didn't know I had that, but I did. And, and I didn't, and part of it also is there is sometimes there's Asians who believe the model minority myth, and there's non-Asians who believe the model minority myth, and there's people of color who believe the model minority myth, and there are people who resent Asians because they do believe, we're taking more than our fair share and everything like that. And so the thing that people don't understand is like, yeah, I mean, there's no competition in oppression, right? But
Exactly.
people of color working together, we can do amazing things. But if we like start fighting against each other, which is what the model minority myth does, it puts a wedge between us, then
Absolutely.
that's just, we're just going to do the work of white supremacy for the white supremacists, and that's not a good thing. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lack of awareness. And yeah, and then just like, no one's embracing or whatever necessarily, having allies who don't look like me enough, but when during, after George Floyd, lots of people were so introspective. We're all on Twitter, and the social studies Twitter world is just a great place. And you can see everyone processing on Twitter
Processing
out
it.
loud,
Yes.
right? And
Yes.
I like
And
my,
and putting it in historical context.
mhm. I mean, like that was amazing, and that was good. And there's history that there's so much history we all miss out. We can all share, and we
Mhm.
can learn from each other. And I saw, Black friends. I mean, people were all grieving, and Black friends were speaking up, and sharing stuff, anti-racist stuff, and other things like that. And people were supporting. And then white friends were feeling guilty, like, oh, like I'm sorry, I'm white. And then the Asians were kind of like in between, and we're kind of quiet, um, trying to figure out where our place was. And I think we started to figure it out. But during that time, it was really a weird, uncomfortable time, but really introspective and a time of growth. And during that time, I reached out to Angela, and I was working on something. I was going to take a virtual trip to Angel Island to tell my grandfather's story. That's People say it's the Ellis Island of the West, but really it's not, because the Chinese were not welcomed. It was a gatekeeper. But I saw Angela had posted a story about an attack on Asian in Boston on the subway. And I'm like, wow, I really admire her. This person's really cool. She's really smart, and she's really bold. Like, I don't feel bold enough to do something like that, but she did that on Twitter. So being the bold person I was, I DM'd her. I didn't tweet her.
I remember, because I was starting to feel this like nagging, you know, like as soon as a pandemic happened, and there were incidences at not my school, but there was an incident at my kids' school, and the principal had written, you know, there was an anti-Asian, like some discrimination and some discriminatory language in a bathroom or something like that, and so had sent a letter home, and I started getting this like nagging feeling, and I was like starting to see what was being posted. So I think it posted, it was partly like around April of 2020. So we'd all been remote for a little while, and I was like starting to like go back on Twitter. I had taken myself off Twitter. It was just like things had been so crazy. And I was sort of struggling with this whole like anti-racist language. I was reading Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and like especially after George Floyd, and really feeling like how can we as Asian Americans also be allies with the Black community on this. Virtual field trip would be great, because I've actually done a lot of like reading about Angel Island. I've never been there, but it was just a fun way for Karalee and I to connect. And it was sort of in the midst of like our own struggle, like our own growth and learning as
Mm.
well. So
Angela, you had talked during when you were talking about your time in talking about that incident at the Boston Children's Museum.
mhm.
How did you process that with your children, or did you?
They're
And
too young.
okay,
They didn't know what was going on.
yeah.
And I just moved them out of the way as quickly as possible, but I was not, I heard it. I heard exactly what he said.
What are their
He wasn't trying to be quiet.
yeah. Yeah,
Hmm?
of course they do, of course it's the brazen and bold thing to do, to say things like that.
Yes.
We were before we went live, you were telling me that your daughter is 16, like your children are teenagers. How
Mhm.
are they experiencing what's going on in the world? How are they processing it?
I think they're still trying to figure it out. I mean, they're just at the age where they're trying to figure out their identities.
Hmm.
My oldest is involved with the Asian Student Union. Um, but I mean, they're still trying to figure out the language as well. So I'll sit down and talk to them about it. And it's not something they delve into very much. They'll say a couple of things, like a few observations of this happened at school or that happened. Nothing bad happened directly to them, but things that they've heard about. Actually, just recently spoke to my kids' youth group. They have about 100 kids about this topic,
Mm.
because I had emailed the the youth pastor, and I was like, "Hey, what are you doing about this?" So because I go to a Chinese immigrant church, and all the kids in the like all the kids in the area, and I know that they've experienced, like kids have experienced this, but maybe are not comfortable speaking out. So
Right. And you don't, like, their parents might not be, depend immigrant church, depending on the parents, if they speak to them or not. And even being born in America, we don't speak about things. You kind of just go with it. I mean, it's a very Asian American thing to like head down, just do everything. If people do things that are wrong, then you just work harder. We're very hesitant to speak up. But Angela and I have talked a lot about speaking up. I mean, my daughter was called racist slurs in 6th grade, and it's like, now that I'm thinking about now 2021, Karalee is looking back at that. She's 15 now. I'm like, oh, maybe we should have said something. But you just kind of like take for granted that it happens all the time. I went to parent teacher conferences. Someone almost gave me some other Asian boy's report card rather than my son's. Like, we laugh at it, but that's very wrong.
Yeah, these microaggressions build, and
Yeah, there's a
impact.
lot of I mean, there are the blatant racist attacks like Angela's talking about, but there's so many microaggressions.
Mhm.
Death by 1,000 paper cuts, and that's very Asian. And I don't know, I think in our before our Asian American viewpoint upraising, you don't deal with it, you just work harder. I mean, that's what we all inherit from the model minority myth. But I think Angela and I and many other Asians were saying, no, we have to do different, we need to do better, we need to have allies, and we do need to speak up. So um I encourage my kids now. We talk about everything, and they're taking it in. They watch the news, and they cheer and cry and everything in between, and very present, and just a lot of, like Angela says, lots of conversations, helping them to get ready for the world. It's
And
not
so
easy.
thinking about it as teachers, like this historical, you are history teachers too. And so I'm sure you have this historical lens of it as well. What does that
Yes,
historical lens look like?
right. I mean, I mean, Asians don't know their own history. People don't learn Asian history in schools, and there's so much, everything you keep on reading and studying and getting deeper and understanding more. And I hope that people will look. It's so important for us. We're history teachers. History matters. It's so important to understand our past. I teach my students. I want my students, but everyone, right, to understand that history matters. That people experience history. They're not nameless, faceless beings. People experience history. When governmental policies are made, they affect individuals, they affect people, they affect families and communities and and cities and the country, right? It affects people, what is happening. And sometimes when you look at like, oh, it's a black and white picture, they didn't really exist, or there's not even any photos, well, then we don't even, that's not even real history, right? But we need to look at the world with this historical empathy, so that we use that to inform our present, that today when you're voting, and do you care about that person making a living wage? Do you care about that, how that water is going to affect that person? That these just like, yeah, okay, you want to hold on to your money, we all want to hold on to our money, but do we have responsibility to those around us? And I like to hope that many people, hopefully most people, with more history, with more understanding of our past and our present, with people learning to be friends with someone who doesn't look like them, can make this a more empathetic world. And that my students will become citizens who care, who will be engaged, who will be informed, who make a difference, who won't be ones who show up at the Capitol trying to take down our democracy, but they'll be the ones defending it and building it up. So that's why we want to tell our history, right?
Right. This is Karalee's superpower, historical
I know,
empathy.
she's so passionate. Like, she's so incredibly passionate.
You better be empathetic.
Yeah, so you're going back to your question, now that we've like circled around it for a few minutes, that the historical entry points. And let me bring that up. I think, Karalee, you're going to start us off.
So we could start even further back, but we thought we'd start with a really easy 8th grade entry point, is the gold rush. And there's so many things going. Angela could go on forever to tell you what's happening in the world, but it's not a 5-hour show, so we're going to go on. But so the gold rush, right? The gold rush attracts, there's push factors why the Chinese leave excuse me and trying to come to America. But they stick out in the gold fields. They're seen as competition. They're harassed physically and legally, so eventually pushed out of the gold fields, and they take the jobs that no one wants, like Chinese laundries, agriculture, fishing, and stuff like that. Then we need people to build the railroad, and we can range, and so then they go recruit the Chinese. So they kick them out of the gold fields, and they go. This doesn't make sense. Then they go to China and recruit them to build the railroad, and they do a great job. They set a world record, all stuff like that. And then, okay, we're done using you. And then there's a downturn in the economy in the 1870s, and they're blaming the Chinese. And along that time, what people don't realize is that there was the Chinese massacre of 1871. More people are finding out about it, right? 500 people lynched, 17, 18 Chinese people killed. It was really a Chinese scuffle, whatever, but a white person got killed and harmed. And so then, 500 people come down and just kill these Chinese, and everyone gets off. There's no accountability. That's 10% of the Chinese population. And it continues on this physical, they're killing Chinese in broad daylight, lynching them. And they're passing laws that are taking away their rights. They're just ridiculous. Like, you can't have your laundry in a wooden building. You have to have, 500 cubic feet of living space. Everything is just ridiculous. And finally, they're able to make this local problem, the Chinese must go. They're able to make it a national problem. There are people in America who hadn't even seen a Chinese person, but they want the California vote. See, we even mattered back then. So they want our votes. So they take it as a national problem. And so they put it on the Republican and the Democratic platforms. And so 1882, the Chinese become the first race of people to be barred from America. And so the day before, you could have hopped off the boat, gone into America. Exclusion Act happens, you can't. But it wasn't a wall, it was a seed. There were different, if you're a child of American citizen, scholar, etc., you could get in. But this exclusion of Asians continues on. It goes from the Chinese and then the Japanese. So now we're excluding Chinese labor. So we're taking the Japanese labor, but then we exclude the Japanese with the gentleman's agreement. Then we go to Koreans, and we keep on going till we're finally excluding all the Asians. By 1924, by the 1940s, we get everybody. And then we can't even become citizens. So, like some of the Japanese, they like have their kids get the, buy the land, who are citizens, all these things. And we have Angel Island because they decide, okay, you're all illegal. So Chinese, the San Francisco earthquake and fire in 1906, destroys all the citizenship records. And so Chinese who were unskilled laborers, now they have an opportunity to come in, whereas they didn't have an opportunity before. And so they become paper sons and paper daughters. And my grandfather was one. There was no other way to get into America. And you know, many Chinese said this is a moral law, so we have a right to go and do our best to come in and
Karalee, can you explain
wrong.
paper
And
sons?
so the paper son. So you buy papers from a Chinese person, and it says, okay, this is who you are. So you're memorizing a whole identity that's not your own, a new name, you're the village, you know, how many houses in a row, when's the last time you went to the cemetery, is your mom you know, natural feet or bound feet, who's your neighbor to the west, what are their names, what are their ages and their occupations. I mean, just crazy, you know, 200 pages or more that you have to memorize. And then you go to Angel Island and they interrogate you. If I test my kids, so I go, and just simple, who are your neighbors, what's your grocery store, how many windows on your house, and go, okay, answer these questions, then have someone at home answer the questions. And like, how many of the kids match up the questions with their relatives' answers? Hardly any, because it's like impossible. Who do you know how many windows are in your house? I don't know. And the real answer doesn't matter. And even if you are, because they're not going to go to China to check. So even if you are who you say you are, you know, these are absentee dads. They were, you know, had their kids and they've been working in America. The kid doesn't even know dad. And then they go, what's the floor made out of? Well, the kid says brick, dad says dirt, because it was dirt when he was in China. The kid made the floor brick. So, right, it was really unfair. The Chinese were detained, they were confined, they were locked up. We just took my kids there this week on Wednesday for the virtual field trip. And you know, they weren't free to move about the island, and they were assumed guilty until they could prove otherwise. So that was Angel Island.
I've been, and some of the artwork and the poetry still on the wall, like, just is like so powerful.
Yes, so powerful and depressing.
Yes. Yep.
I mean, I do a lot of migration. It's one of my themes in my world history class. And there's a lot of sort of parallels today with, you know, on the border, like what's going on there. It's so even, you know, if we're looking at any aspect of history, you can see it, this really very exclusive pattern, right?
What do you think are some of the most, where you see the commonalities the most? What do your students recognize as the biggest commonalities?
Well, just first of all, exclusion, because they're not part of us. And you know, like the demonizing too. And I think Karalee was mentioning a couple of the different like laws, because they were afraid of, you know, bringing criminals and prostitutes, and you know, like, so certain laws that were very, very restrictive of certain people coming in, and the breaking up of families. You know, that's something we're still
and it's
seeing.
false fear of economy too. I think that's this idea that it's not going to be good, that the jobs that are here will be taken by this other group, which is this false economic narrative, actually.
Yeah, for sure. And things kind of get worse because we have Japanese internment that starts happening in 1942. And I think that's probably something that is covered pretty widely now. But again, just that whole trope of perpetual foreigner, that even though many of the Japanese who were interned were citizens or were born here, right, in the United States, yet they were seen as the enemy. The Immigration Act of 1924 was extended until 1952, which meant that no Asians were eligible for citizenship, even if they were born, or even if they had lived most of their lives here and contributed to the economy, things like that. Again, those like migration themes continue on today. The positive change, though, in 1960 Act, which a little the quotas and opened it up for Asians to start migrating. And in 1968, born out of the civil rights movement, we do have an Asian American movement that happens in 1968. And a lot of the Asian Americans who are here started realizing, actually banding together, even though we know how diverse they were, like banding together, they had political power. So continuing on and thinking about, well, in solidarity, that's where we can make change, right? So they realized that, seeing what was going on in the civil rights movement. And then there was another economic downturn in the 1980s. We have Vincent Chin here. Here's a picture of him. And he was basically bludgeoned to death by two auto workers who had assumed he was Japanese. He was Chinese, but that doesn't even matter. But they, after murdering him and they were put on trial, they basically were just given probation, and a small fine. And that was actually the starting of a lot of the sort of political action movements for Asian Americans. And then we come to the pandemic of 2020. I know there's a lot of other details in there, and we have some resources that can point people to if they want to read more deeply and look into it more. But with the rise of the pandemic in the spring of 2020, the rise of anti-Asian hate and violence continues. And there's the organization, the Stop AAPI Hate, collected data, and these are only reported over 3,700 reported cases of hate and violence against Asians from March of 2020 to February of 2021. This is 150% increase of violence and hate crimes against Asian Americans, at a time where across the nation, hate crimes is actually on the decrease. Sort of culminated in Atlanta's shooting. And that's sort of led to this new wave. And Karalee and I, we've gotten together with a lot of other AAPI teachers. We've been doing a lot of teaching and learning ourselves, and reaching out and finding resources, because we're realizing, I think this is definitely a big turning point for me, because I was always I'll still be sort of in the background, but really finding my voice too, and sort of speaking out, because that was a big deal.
What do you think
What?
about the bill? What do you think about the bill that just passed?
No, I'm really glad that it happened, and I think within this environment that is really needed. But I think Karalee had a moment where she's like, there is one senator who did not vote for it.
Yeah,
And
how could not, how could you not? I mean, and it took a sadly, it took Atlanta. Sadly, so many, Black friends losing their lives, George Floyd losing his life to get us to this moment. We'd rather no one lose their lives.
Yeah.
But somehow America is dense, and we forget our history, and we forget, systemic racism is ingrained in our DNA. It's part of who we are, and we're slow learners. But I think Angela and I feel a little hope that even though the tragedy of Atlanta and the kind of journey that Angela and I have been going through a lot, the two of us finding our voice. Keisha, if you asked me a year ago, I said no. So, that's a good thing that we're saying, well, what can we do to make a difference? How can we affect the world in a positive way with our tiny little AAPI voices? So thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for being an awesome ally.
No, and thank you all for agreeing. And I'm glad it wasn't last year. I'm glad.
No, I would have replied to the DM.
Exactly. I'm so glad that we can have this conversation and ground it in historical knowledge, so that people don't see it as just some random instances. That there's history behind this, and every time I tend to see, and you all tell me if you agree, that there tends to be a link between times of crisis and heightened racism, especially in the AAPI community. How do you all think that these increased instances of hate and violence culminating in, like the tragedy as you just mentioned in Atlanta, what do they really reveal about racism and xenophobia in the US?
I'll start there because I was like the when you asked, I was like, oh yes, definitely for sure. There's definitely like a latent racism. That sounds weird, but um, I've been reading. I just finished the book by Isabel Wilkerson Cast,
Yes.
um, and she starts the book in that first chapter, and she entitles it "The Toxins in the Permafrost." And it's about the impact of climate change on the people in Siberia, which it's like, okay. I was like, okay, I'll follow along. But then she continues saying that in 2016, there was a heat wave that hit the Siberian tundra, right? And it's right above the Arctic Circle. So this heat wave is like, it's it it's a big deal, right? And it starts sort of melting that permafrost, and dozens of the herding people of that area started getting really sick and dying. And so there's just like this sort of emergency for the Russian government. It's like, what is going on? And after much testing, they realized it was a releasing of anthrax from the Russian permafrost that had been encased like from 1941, when there was a big I guess epidemic amongst reindeer. So it was encased, and with the melting, right, the pathogen was exposed, and it awakened the spores, and which infected the reindeer and the herders. And so she ties it into sort of the reactivation. There's always this latent racism, and when there's times of pressure, when there's times of, and often it's connected with economic pressure. But in this case, I think with the pandemic, there was a lot of fear, and that's like, that's because it's spreading globally. It's like, what's going to happen? No one knew, right? But I think there are other instances of crisis, just again, pulling through history. So these kind of fears that generate racism and othering still exists very, very much. And for example, the bubonic plague, I just, taught that last term with my ninth graders. The Black Death of the 1300s, we have the scapegoating of the Jews, right? And in Strasbourg, about 800 of them were burned to death. And there was a bubonic plague actually at the turn of the century in San Francisco, was blamed on the Chinese community, and they were quarantined they could not leave Chinatown. So there are like instances of this we can pull out. That disease has often been linked to racism too, or instances of othering. And so the COVID pandemic was that heat that released the latent racism that had been there. So there have been instances I know that have continued to happen, but maybe not reported, not at this level, right? So I think a lot of that it's not a recent phenomenon, and is part of the permafrost of American institutions and systems, and it's still leading to the death of so many people of color. And we can just even look at the events of this one week and how crazy that is. And people are like, if people should not be surprised, right? There's definitely, especially as we sort of continue in the pandemic and the economic downturn and all of that, it's just bubbling to the surface. So
I love that you tied into that story. Isabel, she's just such an amazing storyteller, and to
yeah.
link all of that. And what I appreciate about the bill is that it makes it easier to report these instances, so that we're no longer in the dark about
Yeah.
how often this happens. That we can speak with accurate numbers, and then we know that data is important and statistics matter, and so we put our money behind things that we know happen, that we can track.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Right.
no, I
Facts,
just
facts
finished.
matter.
I know, I just finished the book yesterday. So I was like, wait a second.
Exactly.
Vacation's ending, you must finish.
I know, exactly.
That's it till the end of the year, school year.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. Facts matter. Representation matters. Since we still ain't for Auburn. I mean, we need positive Black representation all over the place. We
Mhm.
need positive Asian representation all over the place. And because we don't have this, we have these stereotypes, we have these tropes. We believe, oh, you're all this, you're all that. And so the eternal foreigner myth needs to leave, because we're just as much a part of America as everyone else is. I teach at a predominantly Asian school, and throughout the pandemic, I've been talking to my kids. I know not all the teachers are talking to their kids. Teachers are, remote learning is hard for everyone, and people need to acknowledge that. Some people just get cranky, but it's like, okay, let's just acknowledge it, let's honor it, and then let's figure out what to do. And so throughout the time, my students have expressed some fears. So they're not going crazy, but they do express fears and concerns. And as we talked about, going back to school, going to concurrent learning, not surprisingly, the majority of my students didn't come back. I have I have the biggest class I have is in person 11, and the smallest I have is 4. The great majority of the kids are still online, and concurrent learning is not for the faint of heart. I salute everyone else doing it. But in California, right, 44% of the incidences that were reported, right, just reported, were in California. That's not okay. And how are we taking care of our students? Beyond my individual classroom, not that I'm amazing, but I do my best. But, how's my school taking care of my students? How's my district taking care of my students? There was an article or something I read somewhere, like going back to school, let's not forget that social emotional element. It's more important than standardized testing, caring for our kids so that they can be, self-actualized individuals, people who feel confident, who don't have to feel, timid and in fear. But this pandemic is making them fearful. My own kids, you think, oh, this stuff doesn't happen to me. Part of it is probably Angela and I repress it, but things do happen. So my own kids who are teenagers, like I said, they've experienced racism throughout their lives. And recently they were in the store standing in line. I wasn't there, Dad was there, and people called them Wuhan. I'm like, what? I thought I was in a nice, diverse community, but guess not. So these issues persist. It's not okay. We can't other people. We can't stereotype people. We're all humans. We all belong to the human race, and we need to remember that.
Yeah, I'm hoping that we are moving towards that. Although every time I think that we're moving in that direction, um, social media can be the gift and the curse,
Mm.
because you see, like, you think you see progress, and then I go on social media and I see an idiot, and I'm like, oh goodness.
Block, go on.
Yeah, like, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly,
I
exactly.
know. I mean, xenophobia. Okay, I think Karalee and I are in the fall. We did an SS chat reads hashtag SS chat reads of Erika Lee's
Yeah,
newest book, America for Americans, and that's going to be one of our
Resources.
book resource. Yeah, our book recommendation. And I was like, as I was reading, she's basically like xenophobia is an American tradition. It's really hard to swallow that. It's almost like, in systemic racism, it's actually, they're two sides of the same coin, right? And it started from the very beginning of the history of the United States, even before, like, history of America. And it's the part of the system that protects white supremacy.
mhm,
And all of the issues that persist for AAPI and for all communities of color are not new ones, but when they flare, people seem surprised. Um, but I had an epiphany. Well, this summer I did a ton of reading, because after, George Floyd's murder and all of this stuff, and I've never really gone out to march or protest, and I went to several, and I was like, but I feel like I don't, even though I'm a history teacher, I was like, I need to learn. And my church started a racial justice group, and we watched 13th. We watched, we watched Just Mercy. They started reading How to Be an Anti-Racist. And then I started reading, I said, I want to dig deeper. And I started reading Michelle Alexander's The Color of Law, and Kendi's big book, Stand
yeah,
from the Beginning. And then Erika Lee's book, after reading hers, it sort of like something clicked in me in terms of understanding the depth of the structural racism that exists in the United States, that it's so layered together that it's going to be that's why it's so hard to take it apart, right? And now just finished reading Caste, right? I was like, oh my gosh, this
You
is
got
like
a great book list going on,
I
by
was
the
like, this is like a human problem.
way.
It's not just, and she makes reference to like globally,
Mhm.
but also good examples of how other people have taken care of or have started addressing some of those issues, right? And it's just like it's a human problem that needs persistent work, but but throughout most of the United States history, it's just been so built up. It's so like encased. And I think part of it is, you're right, like social media, lack of representation, as Karalee was saying, lack of representation in education, in pop culture, in politics,
Mm.
and in the past, less so now. I think we see better examples across the board. But like, I have another slide for this one about like how Asians were portrayed. These are like what were portrayed, long, I can't even say his name. It's just so awful. This is like what I grew up seeing, right? And then Mickey Rooney, right, with yellow face, and it's just like these negative portrayals. Better now, but then when there should be an Asian actor cast, they don't cast an Asian actor, like because they're like, oh, we go to, but so some of that part is part of it as well. So there's so many different levels. This is just one, in terms of media, but we have to look at curriculum or education, politics, all different areas. And
Right. All
we all know
spaces.
this as all spaces, right? We know this as people of color. Um, this, like, it's kind of intuitive now. But
We
for
know
me,
this, but not all the people
not
in charge
everyone
know this.
does, right? And I know I felt like this summer and this year has been this like this crash course education for me. And being a history teacher, I was like, why did I not know these things? Why did I never learn this as, majoring in history? And I took primarily actually American history courses. Why did I not know this or learn this, or why
Because we're
wasn't it
not taught,
discussed?
because I think it's so white centric. I think American history has been so white centric in perpetuating this master narrative that we don't often get to become the fabric of America. Other stories don't.
I think the hopeful thing is all three of us are educators, and there's so much hope in our students.
Mhm.
Um, that I taught them about systemic racism for the first time, and they're like, "Why did I never learn this? I'm going to talk to my parents about this." And just the responses that they had in their own little worlds, in their own little spaces, that they understood, their responses were so positive. That gives me hope. That's why we need to keep doing this. That's why we need to inform. That's why we need to tell the whole history in its complexities, with the good stuff and the bad stuff and everywhere in between.
Yeah.
We don't need to whitewash it. We don't need to be afraid. We can be bold, and we can deal honestly with our shortcomings.
And we
We
can learn
want
and
our
grow.
ideals to match our reality together. The reality needs to match the ideals.
Absolutely. And I think that this element of perfection doesn't exist, right? I think that there's this desire to have American history be without blemish. And I remember I was teaching a social studies class when I was an eighth grade teacher, and my principal came in, and I was teaching about manifest destiny, and talking to students about, like, okay, what does this truly mean, though, to say, to use God as this tool um, to subvert the power and the will of indigenous people and to occupy their land and space. And my principal said, hey, Keisha, come see me after class. And I'm like, okay. And so he's like, you might not want to say that in class. And I'm like, well, why? He's like, well, I think that would get some parents angry. And I said, then I'm not teaching history. And I'm not really educating our students about the complexity of US history. Like I don't teach for parent compliance. I teach because I'm teaching the truth. And I think that that has been the framework, though, in which we've taught. And that's scary. What do you all think, within the AAPI community? what has resistance looked like historically and now? I know we talked about it a little bit, but I
Mhm.
always think it's so important for all people to understand that resistance, first of all, doesn't look one way, and that resistance hasn't isn't just a now thing. It has been a historic um, um, events too within historic.
Yeah, I think one thing that's little known is the involvement of Asian Americans, AAPI, in the civil rights movement,
Mm.
and the big names, you know, like Grace Lee Boggs, and Yuri Kochiyama and Frank H. Long, and those, you know, those might find its way into textbooks. But there's other things that happened during the 60s, like the longest student sit-in to fight for ethnic studies
Mm.
in California, like I think it was San Francisco State, and some of the UC campuses, and you know, like so, some of the yellow power that came out in the 1970s, and I've yet to learn more. I'm actually, my next book is also Erika Lee's The Making of Asian America,
Yes.
is on my next check. I just checked it out, and I actually own it, but I decided I wanted to sort of read it on my read on my Kindle. So I wanted to find out more because, you know, the Asian American Pacific Alliance, that, you know, the first sort of political action groups that sort of pulled together in the 1960s, all of these, I think it for me to know about it and then to be able to teach my students to know that they have agency, you know, that these are there were the students that got ethnic studies going all across the country, right, in the late 60s, 70s. um and so yeah, so for me it's just looking, that resistance looks at just uncovering and learning about and then teaching about.
I love
Yeah,
that.
and you know, resistance is speaking up, and resistance, you know, looks different ways. Like suffrage, we always tell it as this white suffragist story, but I I never learned till recently. Like I'm sad to say, about Mabel Ping-Hua Lee. Everyone needs to learn about her. She was amazing. I'm like, I need a T-shirt of her for the History T-shirt Showdown. But and I love that Frederick Douglass spoke up against the Chinese Exclusion Act. That's another awesome thing that people need to learn. And that, you know, we just like, oh, it's the model minority, they don't speak up, nothing's ever happened, but it does. It's just that stories aren't necessarily told. And you know, history takes, I mean, we have a short history in America and we're always running out of time telling it. And Angela's doing your world history, you're running out of even more time. But we can all speak up, right? Just here that this conversation is resistance, allyship, reaching out to people who look like you, to people who don't look like you, to work together to change in little and big ways. You know, tweeting out on Twitter, sharing, you know, good sources of information, not retweeting lies and things like that. Angela and I, this past Monday, we just went to bystander training with 2,900 friends, sponsored by Asians Advancing Justice. So Holoback is giving these bystander trainings. They're online. It's like an hour, and they give you these tools, because like you see something happening, you don't know what to do, and everyone's talking about how, you know, the change, you know, what was a change maker with George Floyd, like these videos that were taken,
Mhm.
and you see this, and people were courageous enough to do that. But another friend said, well, but they weren't, they just took a video, that's all they did. Well, I go, well, in bystander training, you have to think about your own safety first, which is totally valid. But if there's nothing else, hey, if you can take a video and you can document that, and hopefully the person knows okay after, then you give the video to that person so they can decide what they're going to do with that. You don't go make it viral, you know, yourself. You know, you can you can distract, you know, there's different things you can go, and you can go delegate, you can ask someone to help out. So it's empowering to learn these tools that maybe Angela and I would instinctively think about, or like, oh, you know, you look on the list, what can I do? It was like so simple but so profound. And you know, that's like an awesome way to resist, that we don't have to accept the narrative that, you know, all those terrible pictures of no one doing anything, but that we could do a little something in our world. And if everyone did a little something, then maybe we can get these, we hopefully get these numbers down, for, and not just anti AAPI hate stuff, but all these incidences that should not be happening.
Exactly. I love that that it's intergenerational, that the examples that you gave, like just so even young people know that they have agency and they have power to also create change in the world. So we talked a lot about allyship and what that looks like. Is there anything else you all want to add about that? What solidarity and allyship looks like?
Yeah, and I think Karalee sort of mentioned the Holoback bystander intervention training, and that's something um, uh, the Asian Student Union at my school asked for last year. They said, you know what, we see this happening, but we don't know what to do or how to say it. So I've actually been thinking, and I've been working with I've been speaking with the advisor of the Black Student Union at my school and saying, hey, you know what,
Mm,
this is something maybe we can work through with our kids, because sometimes they see it happening and they might they might internalize it, or they'll talk amongst their friends and say, I can't believe this happened.
mm,
But what if we work with our students and teach them, like, so similar to bystander training, but for students,
mm.
right? And not, you know, even for small things, it's like things that they can intervene and sort of ask and say, hey, what do you mean by that? You know, like little things. And the kids say, well, we've never really had an opportunity, so it's hard to come. And I think that's what this Holoback bystander training is doing, is giving us like thoughts, and they gave us scenarios, you know, to work through, or we can do like simulations where something happens, you know. So I think it's just those little things, sort of reaching out, um, and sort of being an ally. Actually, it's similar to Karalee. I think a lot of the things I've learned about being a good ally has come from my Black friends and colleagues,
Mm.
because I I think this doesn't come naturally to me. I think a lot of, and part of the silent, being, you know, the silent Asian and stuff like that, a lot of it is sort of from our political framework, or from where our parents are from. It was dangerous to speak up. Like,
Mm.
you would lose your life or get
Yes,
imprisoned,
I
like
think that's a
right
really
away.
good point.
You know, so that's part of like, oh, keep your head down. And, you know, part of like sort of the Asian American cultural norm, keep your head down, don't make waves, because a lot of the immigrant parents may have come from places
Mhm.
where it was dangerous to do that. And that's what they've passed down. Stay safe, like, don't speak up, don't get yourself in trouble, you know. So just learning how to speak up and saying things. And the here's a good example. Like, I was part of a committee, um and I would often try to, you know, like, say something, be really timid about it, or not even be heard. And then I had a Black colleague who would be like, hey, everyone, Angela has something important to say. You know, it's just like, started calling attention to me, which made me really uncomfortable, but I always thanked her after. Because I was like, yeah, it was like, I would say something, or whisper it to her, and then she would be like, you just said that 10 minutes ago. Why didn't you just say it to the group? You know, so little things like that. Um, and again, we just understanding the Black and Asian solidarity during the civil rights movement, going to moments like that, because I know otherwise, like, there's so many wedges, like we had talked about it earlier, the wedges against solidarity, like the model minority myth, right? And even even, you know, historical events like the LA riots. I think that that is something we need to work through, and we need to talk about, and we need to put it in, you know, we need to like just talk about that elephant in the room,
Absolutely.
and deal with that.
We don't talk
um
enough. I don't think we talk enough about after internment, when Japanese folk came back to their homes in San Francisco, that was they were inhabited by Black folk, and that created tension in the San Francisco community between the Black and Japanese community. And we don't have dialogues about kind of where these tensions came from, because this tension isn't a tension this actually isn't a tension really between Black and Japanese, or Black
mhm.
and Chinese. This tension is a white supremacist it's rooted
Yeah.
in whiteness.
Oh yeah, totally. And then we end up fighting over the scraps.
Yeah.
So for us to understand that and see it and say, hey, if we walk together in solidarity and work to break down the systemic racism, all of those layers, right, that are encased in our society, that we can work together and make it a more just and equitable society. It won't be perfect. It's going to be a really hard work.
Yeah.
But to keep chipping away at it together, and right, in numbers, there's strength. So
Amen.
Wow, you've left Karalee speechless. That's oh my goodness.
She's so profound. Angela's very deep.
Well, as history teachers, I'm sure you see history as hopeful and the bridge to better things. How can history help us grow in humility and in humanity?
I think like it always starts with empathy. It always starts with empathy, with historical empathy, with telling human stories, telling fragile, frail, flawed human stories. But we need to know these stories. We need to impact them. We need to go through the hurt. We need to grieve. We need to grieve, maybe our false narrative that we believed about our country, but then we need to heal and go on and grow and grow into the country we need to be, where all the we is included in we the people, where all men really are people, are created equal. There's, like I said, there's no competition and oppression. We waste so much time fighting against each other. When Atlanta hit, people from across the country reached out to me, lots of Twitter friends. And at first when they reached out to me, it's like, oh, that's nice, but my other friends need it more. And all the Asians, we were talking to each other a lot too, and just how are you doing and checking in. And I am good at checking in on people. But as we continue talking, I'm like, oh, that was really, I really do appreciate them reaching out, and I really did need that. And then the voices that did reach out made you realize, like, oh, why didn't these people reach out? Mm-hmm. And like I say all the time, we really are better together. So be human together, grieve together, grow together, learn from each other. That's what we need to do. I have a friend who said one of her goals was to get to know 3 people who do not think or look like her. And I think that is awesome. That should be a law. No, just kidding. I mean, but wouldn't that be a great place if we all became friends with people who didn't look like ourselves? Then we'd realize, oh, the other is our friend. You're an amazing person. Rather than, oh, over there, I don't know who you are. You must be scary. You must be bad. You must be wrong. I'm going to call a name at you. I'm going to attack you. We need to say no to that.
Yeah, I think we've had enough of that.
Yeah, that's enough. We're done.
We're done. We're done with that. We are absolutely done with that. Well, you guys have been amazing. Can you guys answer my lightning round questions?
I was on Family Feud before. I didn't do very well on Fast Money.
Well, I'll slow it down for you then. Not too fast. And these are kind of easy. These are good teacher type questions. So, what is something that you want to learn in 2021?
I need to continue to learn how to speak up, when to speak up, and how to use my voice. I'm still finding my voice.
And I think along the same lines is I need to learn how to be a better ally.
What's something you want to unlearn?
I want to unlearn perfectionism.
Hey, you took mine.
We can unlearn together.
Okay. Yeah, I know. I challenged her. I was like, we should just let it go. Just let it go. Yeah. I mean, it's like, go to sleep.
Sometimes though. I think being a teacher breeds that. Like it kind of feeds that monster.
Yeah.
That monster of perfectionism. Angela, you're reading everything right now.
No, not everything. Oh, but
she needs some fiction. Image. Angela needs some fiction.
Okay, so here, let me share it. These are our to read
awesome
list. America for Americans. Jane Hong, I think neither Karalee nor I have read it, but we're
reading it really soon.
I know, we're great.
I'm a Jane Hong fangirl.
Yes. No, you're friends with Jane.
Okay, I'm friends too. Well, I'm friends and fan.
All right.
Wow.
And then Karalee.
And then Slanted, Simon Tam. Do you know the book Slanted?
No, I don't.
Simon Tam. Awesome book. Awesome. Highly recommend it for Asians. Asians who know themselves, Asians who don't know what it means to be an Asian in America, Asian allies, Asian whatever, everyone. Because he tells his story about being an Asian in America. and the microaggressions and bullying and everything like that. And he decides to name his band the Slants. And the trademark office tells him he can't because it's disparaging to Asians and their evidence is bad. But they let other non-Asian groups use this term and trademark it. So he took like 8 years to fight to go all the way up to the Supreme Court. Ruth RBG is there when the decision is made, so you have to read the story. But it's awesome. But he came to talk to my students, and it was awesome that my students got to hear someone so awesome who went to the Supreme Court who looked like him, and that shows you that representation does matter.
Yes,
and students who aren't Asian got to see him too, to say, hey, there are cool Asian people out there.
Yep.
And then the final one's Cast, which I think probably widely has been read. I'm a little slow on picking up, and I started it and then I put it aside to read other things, and then I just finished it. So those are our book recommendations.
Our recommendations.
That's awesome. Thank you all for those recommendations.
Oops.
What's your hope for the world?
Angela, you want to go?
Oh, I just want a more, that's so big. I just want more compassion towards people and equity and justice. So we were talking about that because that was one of your original questions, and we didn't know how to answer that. So I took it out because I was like, I don't have a way of articulating it, but it's
snuck it back in.
I know. I just felt like I don't know how I'd answer that, but that is definitely something I want to learn more about because those are all big ideas that we all aim for, right? We all want for everyone or for our children. And I think, like that's a human commonality. It's like, who doesn't want those things for our children?
Absolutely.
So,
Karalee, what about you?
I agree. I said empathetic humans.
Yeah. Yep. And as a teacher, we know how much that means. When a student has empathy, when a child has empathy, then they're not growing up to be a Kyle Richtenhouse or a Dylan Roof. They have formed a human connection, which is why in-person learning is so important, and having students be able to go back and safely go back and engage with one another without fear as well.
Yes.
So we've learned so much in just our time together. If people want to learn more from you, how can they find you on social media?
We are both on Twitter. Angela, what's your handle?
Yep, it's right there. It's Mrs. History Lee.
And I'm History Frog.
Yeah.
Happy Frogtastic Friday. It's Friday. Happy Frogtastic Friday in my classroom.
And then we also put it together a Wakelet with resources for if you wanted to understand more history. I have some articles about building allyship and solidarity, and just generally, my top 20 that I culled from.
You didn't give all 200 links.
No, I know that I culled from between me and Karalee. So.
Wow. Well, thank you both so much for giving up your time and pulling together to teach us today. We were members of your history class, and we so appreciate just your perspective and all the things that you shared. And I'm so grateful, Angela, to get to know you and call you friend now.
Yeah, thank you so
much. See each other.